Hi everyone, this is Dr. Giobbi, and today we are going to be discussing play therapy. And I'd suggest that you first read chapter 17 and then tune into this discussion on the materials of play therapy presented in that chapter. Play therapy is one of the most valuable tools you can use. And I'll say not only with youngest children, sometimes when we think of play therapy, we think of children 6, 7, 8 and younger, 10 and younger. And then by 12 years old in adolescence, we tend to think more of one-on-one therapy, depth the therapy where we're talking. But I'd like to present adding an element of play, adding an element of play in a way that can even be offered and useful in adult relationships. And of course, the essence of play, of what we call play, of what playing is, has to necessarily change depending on the individual that we're working with and also the age group, of course, and the goals. So my approach to play therapy is a little less structured than as it is presented in the textbook. But the textbook will offer you a very sound kind of academic view of assessing outcomes and all that stuff that academics love to do. The tone that are involved in those sections of the textbook where it starts to sound academic-y, the language, according to research and according to this person and that person. If you actually read some of the most profound writers on play therapy, I'm talking about Anna Freud, that's Sigmund Freud's daughter, Melanie Klein for certain, Margaret Lowenfield. I would also recommend Virginia Axline. If you read their texts on play, the texts are not scientific-y. They're not academic-y. They don't have that tone of uninvolvement, of removal, of doing something from an uninvolved distance. That's so common today, especially in our field, that is dominated with the desire to be taken seriously as a science. I think when you get into the writings of Klein, Freud, Anna Freud, that is, Lowenfield, Axline, you're going to find, and others, you're going to find that it's a much more personal approach, a much more living and vibrant, and for me, more convincing and interesting understanding of playing as a form of doing therapy. I want to give you just a few examples from my own work with people of all ages and my work with myself. And that might actually be a very interesting thing to discuss with you is when we're talking about play therapy, we tend to think of ourselves as the therapist and the other is the play, but we can do our own play therapy with ourselves. And maybe as adults, we're not going to sit down with puppets and we're not going to sit down with, action figures or something like this, but playing in the sand at the beach, building things and shapes maybe, and playing with things we find in the woods, sticks and rocks, land art, playing with an instrument, maybe even an instrument that we don't know how to play, going to the pawn shop and getting a flute or sitting down at the piano and just experimenting and playing. And I'm saying play with a capital P, playing with the sounds that you can produce, or a drum, any kind of instrument, your voice, maybe writing, free writing, experimenting with free verse poetry, writing a short story, using paints and clay and drawing and painting. These are all forms of play. As we get older, our idea of play changes. Some people are very limited by the idea that play has to do with playing games. And I think that you would have to really be aware when you're working with a client, a child. I typically think of around 10 or 11 being the ages where we play in a sense with toys, play with figures, play in the sandbox. We can also play with paints and instruments and with fantasy stories, making up stories. And then when we get to, around 12 years old, 12, 13, 14, up through adulthood, adolescence to adulthood, our playing can be more about art, expressive arts therapy. Expressive arts, that means using drama, so writing a play and performing it. Poetry, writing poetry, writing narrative story. We can also have visual arts, the plastic arts, so clay and sculpture, carving, painting, drawing, all of these sorts of arts, expressive arts, plastic arts, we call them, the visual arts. We can have the musical arts, writing music, playing music, making music. Free improvisational music making can be very therapeutic in many ways. So this idea of play, I would say, is very broad. And the play becomes, in some ways, cathartic. So the individual, in coming into contact with quieting the thought world, coming into contact with emotions and expression. This is what Carl Jung, someone whom we aren't covering in this course, but would be someone to really look into. Carl Jung developed a process called the active imagination method. And if you look this up, you'll find plenty of information. There's a great book, Encountering Jung, on active imagination, which I'll link to. And active imagination is a method for training older children and adults, or maybe even young children, you can work with them in this way, in allowing art work to come from the unconscious, allowing it to unconceal itself, allowing it to reveal itself, allowing it to manifest, and then learning that this comes from a part of ourselves. It's not intentionally directed. It's not consciously made art with the goal of making money or selling it or becoming famous or even showing anyone else but yourself. The focus isn't on the product. The focus is on the process. This is, in expressive arts therapy, this is known as high expression, low technique. Anyone can sit down at a piano or pick up an instrument of any sort and do high expression, low technique. Maybe an interesting example of this in the famous people who actually function as artists and become famous is the abstract expressionists of New York, the New York school of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. This is people like Franz Klein and his action paintings. This is people like Mark Rothko and his use of colors. You can Jackson Pollock and his drip painting. These are the abstract expressionists. They were seeking to abstractly represent spontaneous material from their unconscious. Of course, when we're doing expressive arts therapy, and again, you can find many books and videos and online. This is a very hot topic today. When you're doing, you can find all this information online. When you're doing expressive arts therapy, which is a form of playing, I've often found that when I'm doing this, whether it's painting, writing, poetry, obviously for me, spontaneous music making, I find that there's something cathartic that takes place in the act of doing it. And one has to liberate themselves from the idea that you're doing it to be an artist. You're not doing this to be an artist. You're doing this to come into contact and gain insight into ourselves. I'm going to give you an example. I did a project at the piano, and I believe it's over 4 hours long of spontaneous improvisation at the piano. So that means that nothing is pre-planned. I for 10 minutes meditate, and then for 10 minutes I just let my hands drop on the keys and allow them to do whatever they want to do, and I listen to the interesting textures and sounds and volumes and rhythms and time or loss of time, etc. And I found that after I do this for 10 minutes or even just a few minutes, a sense of well-being and peacefulness comes over. I'm going to demonstrate this for you. I won't do it for 10 minutes, but I'll just do it for a minute or two. I'm going to firstly be silent. I'm talking, I'm narrating what I'm doing. I'm closing my eyes. I'm sitting down at my instrument. My eyes are closed. And I'm doing a basic chakra meditation, just thinking of different chakra points and aligning them. And I feel that take place in my body. Now I'm just going to allow my hands to drop on the piano keys. And I'm listening at that combination of tones. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know what it feels like, but it conjures something up. It's telling me something. All play, all art is communication. And I just stay with the sound and feel it. There's a question. And I'll allow my hands to just move on. Now that was an example of play, adult play, older play. Even the interesting thing is with the catharsis that takes place when you stop judging the tone, stop hearing good or bad, and instead listen for interesting new flavors, new colors that are manifesting from unexpected combinations. Something fascinating happens. Individuals who may be musicians, play an instrument, are so accustomed to sitting down and reading the music, reading the sheet music, reading what's written and practicing to become precise and accurate of what the composer wrote, that often the best readers, the most accomplished pianists in classical repertoire and reading music, are at a loss when they just sit down at the piano to just make sounds. They find it very difficult to do what I just demonstrated. I've worked with professional musicians for many years, and this is such a threatening to ask them to just close their eyes and play whatever comes out. They often start intellectualizing. In other words, they go to the safety of something they've memorized, and they're playing music that we would quote unquote say sounds correct. The nature of this is to get beyond correctness, to get beyond the rules and limitations, and allow one the freedom to just explore. We can do this with words, we can do this with paints, we can do this with clay. You might want to label it or be tempted to call it abstract expressionism, whatever you want to call it. The method really comes from Carl Jung and his idea of the active imagination that you can study more. And this is free improv, and it teaches a lesson about judgment. Often in life we go making judgment calls, good, bad, right, wrong. And while it's true that there can be more better functional or more I don't want to use the word appropriate, more there can be choices and decisions that are better, that function better, work better than other decisions. That's not the same as making the judgment of good and bad. So making the observation that one choice might be more beneficial than another choice towards a certain goal. That's different than making than observing possibilities, and it's different than making a judgment call that something is good or bad. Something is just, there's a combination. If you think this is good and somehow this is bad, getting beyond that to hear the beautiful textures that are just beyond good and bad, especially unfolding in time. So it really brings a patient, a client, ourselves out of our comfort zone. It brings us out of a place of societal prescription. This is right. This is what it should sound. That's society. That's very beautiful, very nice, and it's worth listening to and learning and playing. However, if you're describing this as correct or good playing, and this as somehow inferior, bad, simply because it's spontaneously made, that's where the bigger analogy comes on with life. and how we can learn from playing. So I'm speaking to you for adult to adult of using play in a very adult way to understand what this unlocks for a child. The child learns when you play with them that there's a certain flow, a certain awareness and flow of emotions and intentions that they kind of get into that flow of play, into that fantasy world. It's what we call the unconscious, going down deep into an emotional level. And those emotions then seep into the toys they're playing with, seep into the colors they choose, or the lines, or the overall phenomenology of the painting or the piece of music that they're playing spontaneously. And we tap into this and we come to learn about ourselves. Now, as the therapist will observe and look for themes and understand tendencies. And this is one of the part of play therapy, is to become more aware of the conflictual materials and of the personality structures, the way of being, that child's style of life that manifests through their play that wouldn't manifest if you were just asking them questions. So play therapy is a way of discovery. It's a way of discovery with children in their play. It's a way of discovery for ourselves in our play with artistic materials. And it's a way of discovery with our older children and adult patients as well. We have a certain catharsis that takes place once we do these things, once we act on these things, a certain insight that we develop into and emotions that we might be intellectualizing and distracting ourselves from, that once we start playing and using art, we are necessarily coming into direct contact with. We have the tendency to run away from direct contact of intense emotions by putting big words with them, very scientific, intellectualization sounding things. This is something to be careful of. I'm going to describe this in reading this textbook chapter. The textbook has a tendency to intellectualize, as many psychologists do today, to put statistics and experiments and data and all these third-person incidents in between the actual experiencing of the thing directly, phenomenologically, emotionally. And I think playing brings us away from the intellectualized seriousness of the academic work. Now, of course, you will have some children that they will come into your session and all they can do is this. Now, that is all they can do. Loud, pounding. That's much different than using that as part of something whole. So you can use these So you can use the pounding as part of something more that becomes nuanced as a contrast. But many children come in and they're just doing that. And that is another form of estranging oneself from their emotions. So you can, with a child like that, you want to direct them to, now that is metaphorically could be used, paints. What's this? This is when all the paints gets thrown and mixed together. You can explore or scribbling on the page. This is scribbling. That's much different from spontaneous. Spontaneous improvisation. I hope you're feeling the difference as I explain this to you. Obviously, this might not be the kind of lecture you've encountered before in the past. But this is interestingly very accurate to what I do with people when I work with them. So the little child comes in and they're just pounding, that kind of business. or just scribbling on the paper, or just it's not it's not really authentic. It's mindless. It's just yelling out, screaming. You can take that as information and understand this and realize that what's happening here is there's frustration, there's anger, there's confusion, there's inability to understand what to do, there's lack of sensitivity. And you can use that as an opportunity to say, ask the child, what happens? Direct them firstly. What are you feeling? What is it that you feel or experience when you're doing this? Well, how, if you could put a word to this, or you can even use cross materials and ask them to do this in painting with paint colors. And then you can ask them to identify verbally with words what are some words you would use to describe this? Now, not just that, but the force, the volume, the aggressiveness that's in with this. See, what you're doing is you're attempting to cultivate a sensitivity in the child so that they become more self-directed, more aware of what they are, of what their actions are doing, making them introspective. Now, with this child, you might want to then say, what happens if we play an exercise where you play the loud and then play it soft? So they keep their fingers on there and hit whatever they hit. And now keep their fingers there and play it softly now. A little louder and softer again. And what happens if we play each note individually? And then again, loud. Even louder. You see, and then they laugh and giggle and they think this is fun, but you're actually you're teaching a sensitivity of introspection, awareness of one's volitional act. In this, the children come to begin to understand themselves. You can also introduce, if the child or the adult is all about this kind of stuff, you can introduce more structured play. Introduce rules to the playing. So in other words, you're allowed to play notes, but no note can be directly next to each other on the piano. So there always has to be space in between the notes. You can never play notes that are touching each other. So you can't play this, you can't play this, but you can play this. And this adds a new dimension. So the child automatically has to give more thought to this. So it's still spontaneous, it's still random, but they are becoming more thoughtful about what they're doing. And some children do need to become more thoughtful as an experiment. So these are all experiment. Now, incidentally, this is what artists do. Artists experiment. Experimental artists, the parallel with painting or drawing or clay could be using a color wheel and using colors that are directly across from each other rather than colors that are very similar to each other, and then limiting oneself to maybe 2 or 3 colors, or colors that aren't close to each other on a color spectrum, to allow chords to harmonies to appear. These are all ideas of using expressive arts therapy as a part of play. So some of these, this is, if you then do this, of course, with children, you're teaching them cooperation. If there's 2 children together, you're teaching them how to work together, to cooperate, to communicate, in making music together, or making a painting together, or writing a story together. So some of these, as we see, the textbook tells us, overcoming resistance. Play, the resistance is when the person who's doesn't want to come into contact with that spontaneous improvisation of just freely making sounds that they are judging as bad, and only want to play the intellectualized, safe things that some composer wrote that sounds good, that they've rehearsed, that's called overcoming resistance. That person's making a breakthrough in their personality, a breakthrough through limitations that are, quite frankly, I see harness and hold back many people from a creative life, because they're interested in sounding good. They're interested in sounding right, sounding smart. They're interested in being accepted by others. Art and play can allow us to do something that is free of the good opinion of others. Judgment free, just doing, just creating. Communication between the therapist and the student, teacher and student, between student and student, between student and therapist. Competence, giving someone a sense of competence. The idea that one can play loudly, play softly, individually broken in time, that gives a sense of competence in just the awareness of one's possibilities. Creative thinking. What is creative thinking? This is a big topic in itself. Creative thinking is not following the exegesic step-by-step instructions for assembling something from IKEA. That is very useful if you want to put the piece together and have it work properly and be sturdy and work to its best ability. But that's not the only way of thinking. Unfortunately, that's the way of thinking most of us are indoctrinated with in the university and the school system. Creative thinking, and you know the creative types, the creative thinking types, typically drop out of college or become art majors or theater majors, something like this, because there's no really one way prescribed, there's no doing it right or doing it correctly. This is very difficult for many people who have learned a certain worldview that there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things. Now there can be a better way, a more efficient way. I mean, I would be careful of applying this willy-nilly to anything in life. If you, let me give you an analogy here. If you want to go to the beach, you know vaguely, but you're not even so concerned if you get to the beach, but you just vaguely know you're going to go in that direction. And instead of putting the map, looking at a map or putting the app in the phone and getting instead, you just kind of figure your way out there. Some people become very, very upset if they don't know where they're at. Some people just enjoy being lost. I think that's a key of creative thinking. Enjoying ambiguity, enjoying not knowing, enjoying being lost. I would say there's something very therapeutic about learning to embrace ambiguity, uncertainty. A great lesson for children, for adolescents, and for adults. Through role-playing, abreaction, by the way, is very similar to catharsis. It's coming into contact with emotions. Catharsis has a certain release. Abreaction is the encountering of emotions that one is usually avoiding through intellectualization, through thinking in a logical way, not coming into contact with emotional feelings. Role-playing. So in other words, have the child, have the adolescent, have the adult use a play, pretend to be someone that they're not, and see what they have to learn from that. Pretend to be the teacher. The fantasy, of course, this is metaphoric teaching that we've been looking at this. I've been giving you metaphor. I would prefer to call it analogical reasoning. Metaphors are part of analogy, but analogical rather than logical is when you go to the woods and you look at nature and you look at a tree or something happening in nature, and by analogical thinking you come to some understanding of a deeper truth about the human condition or about life through analogy, through the analogy of the strong oak or the tiny acorn that eventually becomes a strong oak, or the way a tree in earliest life grows crooked, remains crooked for life. Of course, other aspects of play that are mentioned in your textbook, attachment, relationship building, I would say beyond positive emotion, any type of emotional contact. Now, when we talk about some of these ideas of game playing, I'd like to give you an example of something to be sensitive to. And that is, some children are obsessed with winning. I'm the winner, you're the loser. It's as we've learned in the past in Adlerian psychology, it's a desire for self-worth and power, of overcoming a sense of inferiority. I would recommend that if you're dealing with a child that's overly concerned with winning and losing, with power, avoid games that have winners and losers, and instead engage in games that are cooperative, building cooperation, where you work together to accomplish a goal. And you can find games like this. So games that are not focused on you win, I lose, I win, you lose, I'm the winner, you're the loser, I'm better than you, and instead build cooperation. So this is a very important aspect to think about. Your text looks at some of the personal qualities of a therapist for play therapy. It's not for everybody. You have to have not only some of these personal qualities, especially if you're dealing with groups of children, you have to have a certain ability to tolerate loudness and chaos and things of this without frustration. I personally have never been good with groups of children. I could do one-on-one with a child, and that's about it, because otherwise it's too chaotic. And the text offers some guidelines for working in groups of children, how many people should be in a group, no more than 6, and things of this nature. So again, here's some of the guidelines that are offered for doing play therapy. And the interesting thing to me is you have to learn this and read this and then forget about it. Because you can't approach play in this way. You have to set boundaries, and but you also have to have a certain flexibility and freedom when you're playing. I am going to turn now to spend some time looking at the different media, the different types of play therapy. You can read about these other aspects on your own. Personal qualities of the therapist should be pretty obvious on those. And also, what's right for a certain child. Jung tells us it's all about balancing. It's all about looking to emphasize the weakness. So if the child is very good at chaos, you want to enter into this, the identification of that chaos, and then and then incorporating structure, teaching them that part of play, that play with structure can be fun too. And this really is quite interesting if you look at the stages that are presented in your book. First you would build the relationship with the child, and then the release. So they come into emotional contact by releasing this emotion, and then you take this emotion, this material you're working with, and recreate it in different ways. And in so doing, you re-experience the same material in a different way. And this comes to some sort of resolution, some sort of insight into what one can do with their inner feelings. So here are some of the materials. So you can material like what do you use to play with? And you can base it on, you can choose materials that are going to facilitate relationships, maybe with family members or with two children or with therapist and child. You can choose play that will enhance expression. You can choose play that helps you as the therapist get insight into the child's world. You can choose play that allows the child to try out different things, different ways of dealing with things in their life, conflicts, etc. That would be fantasy play, maybe with puppets or action figures or dolls. You can do play that provides a child an acceptable way to express feelings that they're bottling up. So these are all different types you can choose what to do in your play based on the goal. So you would think, what is the goal I have with this child? What do I want to help them come into contact with? And here are some of the things you can use. Real life toys, dolls, furniture, telephone, money, animals, nurse kit, household items, etc., kitchen, whatever it is. You can use those. Acting out toys. So for aggression, an aggressive release, punching bag, handcuffs, balls, guns, soldiers, etc. Creative expression, we've talked quite a bit about this. Chalks and sandbox and crowns and clay and paint. Music, I'd add to this. Your textbook doesn't mention music, and it's a big one. And I think that this is really bringing us into awareness of a certain emotional side that talking alone can't do. So here are some of the basic skills I want to turn you on to. Why the therapist, while playing, can bring things to the child's attention, bring to the attention to the child of what they will learn from your example, even by saying, boy, this is making me feel happy. This color makes me feel sad. What does it make you feel? Things of this. This is increasing this ability for the child to introspect and identify what they're feeling and experiencing. Looking at when the child is doing some kind of cooperative work, maybe you're drawing or painting something together, or you say to the child, I'm going to play an accompaniment, and you play a melody, and you might do. You just play this for the child, and then the child, you say, experiment on the keys and write a melody. So you're actually asking the child to, I'll do the child's part now, the child at another instrument or next to you. And maybe the child learns cooperation. They also learn that a mistake is only can also be seen as an opportunity, an opening to something else, not only as a mistake, a wrong note. Miles Davis said that there are no wrong notes. There are only opportunities, unexpected opportunities. And this is a lesson the child learns in life. So cooperation with the other person, maybe you're both working on painting something together or building something together. And also setting limits. You have to, so you can't, one of the limits I set with the child is they have to treat the instrument with respect. You can't close your fist and pound on the piano real loud. You can do tone clusters, but you have to remain respectful of the instrument, and that's setting boundaries. And good therapists, like good parents, set strong boundaries. Some more ideas of strategies of things to use. I'm using music as your examples here, but obviously clay and colored paints. There are great studies and a lot of books written about the association between different colors and different emotions that you will come to learn to read. You can get a book on using art as a way, as a psychological assessment tool. So draw a person, house, tree, things of that nature. Again, sandbox techniques, as you've watched the documentaries, are really useful in this. So I think that this really gives you a good example of play therapy, of the different ways you can approach using play therapy. And I'm including in play therapy expressive arts therapy, which sadly is really not focused on in your book. And I hope that you understand that this is an essential way of not only working with children, but working with yourself and working with other adults. A lot of the things I shared with you today are core concepts of what I do in working with musicians, amateur and professional musicians, and helping them to come into contact with aspects of themselves that they're not comfortable expressing. The classical pianist who can play a Chopin etude but cannot sit down at the piano and just make sounds. This is something you would work on with that client. It frees them up, and necessarily it helps them to come into contact with new possibilities for their own personal expression. When I first started working with students in this way, of all ages, I would say that I was helping them to think more like a composer and less like a performer. And it was my way of saying that this really is, the creative process is really the difference between someone who's a composer or someone who's a painter versus someone who's a scholar of painting or an academic who gives lectures on the painting, or a pianist or an instrumentalist who reproduces the work of a composer. They're two different things. And this way, being a musician or being an artist are two different things. So, broadly speaking, these are some ideas that you can understand with using expressive arts therapy, play therapy, for accomplishing the goals that you would seek to accomplish in your work with children.